All right, part two of our conversations around social institutions. Here we go. Let me get this shared and we will get to it, y'all. Give me 1 second here. All right, all right. Okay, so we left off on the education part. We were headed towards this conversation in regards of how this is going to work. And let's talk about education and how that plays into the field of social institutions. Let me split this out. Okay, so social institutions, like I mentioned, cover a massive gambit, a massive quantity of different areas. We just talked about child abuse, IPV, marriage, etc. Right? Let's go into the social institution of education. Now, we've covered hidden curriculums and other things such before, but we're going to go deeper into it here. So education is understood within the social institutions within the field of sociology from the three paradigms. Blah, blah, blah. We talk about the three paradigms on a regular basis. One of my extra credit assignments for y'all is going to be to be able to write from the epitome and the understanding of the paradigms. Here's an example of me doing it, y'all. So education in three paradigms. Education as a social institution varies in the perspective of the three paradigms: symbolic interactionalism, functionalism, conflict theory, right? How the benefits, socialization, and life implications and equity of opportunities is shown is not equal based upon the perspective you're pulling from, right? They don't all have the same. The hidden curriculum of educational institution plays a large part in developing the self, as we've talked about in class, right? That's what Mead believes, that the self is a fully constructed social entity and that there is no one. Whereas Cooley believes that there is a self, but it's a mirrored perspective of how we understand ourselves as myself, as how others understand me. And Goffman states that, well, it's a mirror and we're managing the impressions of how we understand that. So how do these systems get looked at when we look at it from the paradigms? This is what we're going to cover it from. We're going to be looking at how education is viewed functionalistically, conflictly, and interactionally. Let's get to it. First things first, functionalism. Functionalism, no surprise here, views education as if not the most important, one of the most important social institutions in society in general, right? Durkheim famously says that socialization agents that teach children how to get along with others and prepares them for adult economic roles is one of the most important things. It teaches you the little things, the not manifest importance of function of education, right? But it's the latent. It's the thing that teaches us how to be, how to know, how to act. It provides roles such as norms, values, statuses, and cultural diffusion within the practices of our socialization day-to-day life. It goes on and on. There's so much more. Children learn these rules through society as a whole and how to act in society. It also has what sociologists refer to as placement and social placement systems. Education provides the ability for those who are successful and genuinely academically gifted to potentially have upward social mobility through things like scholarships and getting the recognition they deserve. This is the social placement, right? College and graduate schools are viewed as vehicles for moving students closer to the careers that will give them financial freedom and security. In theory, right? It's not always true. But let's look at the manifest and the latent functions, right? So the manifest, if you don't remember, is the intended. Latent is the positive, but not intended, right? So socialization is the manifest goal of these educational systems that they're looking at. What is the latent function of this socialization? Well, courtship. You might find the love of your life in one of these institutions. It might introduce you to new friends, right? Transmission of culture. That is the manifesting, right? We're going to be able to engage with people from various walks of life. What's the latent function? Well, social networks. It's not intended that you'll meet somebody who will help you become economically independent, but you might, right? Social control, all the different things that we're going to learn in school. Raise your hand. Spoken to. In proper etiquette of engagement, understanding authority, right? These are things it's teaching you. The control mechanisms of you need to be somewhere from a certain amount of time. You have to spend that time doing these things. So it's important. Group work is an unintended but beneficial one. Sometimes it can be the worst, literally, but yeah, you're going to work in groups your entire life. Social placement, this is going to help you know where you stand. Unfortunately, kids be kids and they'd be cruel. They'd be savage. My nephew was savage when he was a kid. But yeah, social placement, you'll know where you stand in the grand scheme of society. Creating of generation gaps. Yeah, you'll get to see if you are no longer hip. I'm running into this as a 35-year-old, right? Most of you Zoomers think that I'm kind of out of touch, and you know what? I am. But that's just the reality. Cultural innovation allows us to have a lot of influence through other cultural dynamics as we are able to be exposed to and be a part of the transmission of culture and the diffusion of values. Political and social integration. You'll see this a lot in school, that you will find out what your family's political affiliation as well as your social status is, and it teaches you these abilities of knowing how to or how to not interact. This is what functionalism views it as. This means that they see it as a social benefit in the sense of the system of society, the social systems, that is not shared within the conflict perspective, which we will get to in a second. Now let's look at education from conflict. Remember, this is a macro theory and it looks at a lot of the inequalities in the world. Essentially, conflict theories view educational systems as reinforcing perpetuation of social inequalities among race, gender, and class ethnicities, whereas functionalism sees it as beneficial. They do not. Opposite view of functionalists holds the status quo and pushes people of lower status into obedience. Think again about the social placement. When was the first time you ever noticed that your clothes might have been a little raggedy or ripped? When a kid told you they were. And then how many times have you seen the rich kid being patted on the back when he had all the tutors to get the good grades, but you didn't have that opportunity because you didn't have the money to do so. Systems such as this incorporate ideas behind ACT and SAT and other standardized tests where the wealthy are capable of hiring literal trainers for the program. You saw this a lot with what went on with all the scandals around people sneaking their kids into college. So are you a genius or are you just wealthy, right? The meme's kind of funny here, but it's accurate. These tests were not being viewed as conflict theorists as benefit, right? They're capital and status and power, and they place you into predictable social placements. Some interesting information here. The meme's funny, but it's true, right? How many of you really think about this? Pause for a second. How many of you are from a good socioeconomic background? Don't be embarrassed about this. That's another taboo, right? The wealthy are told that wealth is the ultimate goal, but when you get wealth, you can't talk about wealth because if you have wealth, then the people who are below you will view you as pretentious if you bring it up. Sure, fact, it's true. However, how many of you judge somebody for being tired at school? How do you know they don't have 3 kids at home when this is something their pipe dream to go to school and they just don't have the patience? Whereas somebody who has nothing fiscally holding them down can have a total great time at school and party and have fun and still get their grades done because they don't need a job nor do they have responsibilities. You never know someone's situation. Never make assumptions. Subjective understanding is huge, right? So do you have a job? Are you paying for college on your own? Are you taking care of people while you're going to college? If you answered yes to any of these questions, well, then we do have news for you. The system does not care. It doesn't. And we'll use these against you towards social placement. The wealthy are going to get wealthier, the poor are going to get poorer. Money talks, bullshit walks, right? Don't worry, the upper class doesn't have these problems and they are thrilled that you benefit with these struggles. And they'll point back to functionalism that poverty has a purpose because it needs to make you angry to get you rich. It's not a great move, right? It's the class consciousness, false consciousness. It's the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. It's the inequalities of the system and the perpetuation of the inequalities of wealth distribution. Funny video here is just talking about Olivia Jade. I know that's kind of older news, but it's a great new reference, right? Pierre Bourdieu, who is an amazing sociologist, right, talks about the idea of cultural capital as the result of these inequalities in the educational systems. These situations build a type of social class reproduction, right? If you are not somebody who went to all these high class events and haven't traveled and had the chance to have cultural capital established, it can be used against you. Pierre Bourdieu talks about this in the sense that we gain a cultural capital by being able to be witnessed and a part of these social experiences. I pulled to Olivia Jade with it because it's interesting. Famously, when she was talking about the whole scandal of getting into the school, she said she didn't need the academic excellence aspect. She wanted the college experience. She wanted to be able to go party and have friends. That was what money couldn't buy. So she wanted that cultural capital of having the fun times on campus. Tracking is a negative thing from the conflict theory perspective, formalizing sorting that places students on tracks that perpetuate inequalities. This pulls from Merton's self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like if you are told that you're stupid and that you can't do anything, you put in all special needs classes or like low-level classes, you tend to not do that well. And the colleges will know about this from your permanent record. Those who are in a higher academic status may be on tracking systems and be able to go to Ivy League just by the merit of the school's placement systems. Schools help train working class students to accept their positions as lower members of the societal according to conflict theory. You are poor, you know you're poor, school told you you're poor, you're not an academic. Oh, I've heard people say I'm street smart, but I'm not book smart. So it perpetuates this inequality and this attitude. So you start seeing this issue. Need pens, tests, papers, teachers in general? Well, we can't afford them. This also has to do with one major concept. If you are or are not aware, now you can slide and zoom in on this when you are on your own because it's a lot of information here, but what we're looking about are the public elementary school systems revenues by the source in the fiscal year of 2012, right? Access is not equal, distribution is stratified. If you aren't aware, high schools and public schools are funded by property tax. Therefore, when you look at this, California and New York being on the top makes complete sense because if you are in a poorer district, what ends up happening is that you don't receive the resources. Teachers have to pull out of their own pocket, and many times it's not even great. Arizona's response to a lot of the shifting and oscillations right now is to say that you don't have to finish college to be a high school, elementary school, or middle school teacher. So that's not going to be great. But what you're seeing is this construction of economics playing into the impact of if you are or not going to be able to head towards Ivy League or have aspirations to go further, because the distribution of wealth to supply those schools with resources is not particularly fair. It's based upon property tax, and property tax has a history of racism and systemic inequalities, right? That there have not been equal opportunities for areas. Poor neighborhoods need help. The kids need to learn. Well, we're not going to perpetuate their learning if they don't have the funding. It's sad. So let's look at this through interactionalist perspective. Yeah, education is an example of labeling theory in action, right? What is your SAT score? What is your ACT score? Low standardized tests or poor performance leads to labels such as low achiever. Again, Merton's self-fulfilling prophecy, such as labels, are hard to shake off. Primary labels and secondary labels, what makes you feel like you're going to be that way? Credentialism, certificates or degrees, that certifications and certificates or degrees show that a person has a certain skill, has attained a certain level of education or met certain job qualifications. This is a symbol of power, right? Someone has a PhD, you're giving them an automatic respect. I get emails all the time referring to me as Dr. McQueen. I don't have my PhD. So it's interesting that that's an auto association, but there you go. Credentialism, an assumption, a role based upon prestige. There is a dynamic of what people see as prestigious, and this is the socioeconomic prestige scale that Weber created. And certain jobs get certain levels of respect, and certain jobs don't. This goes back to Davis Moore thesis. The more socially beneficial, the more the reward should be, both economic and social. But is it true? That's a conversation we would have in class, but I ask you to please have that on Yellow Dig because it's a good conversation. Ivy League comes with perks. Just having Harvard on your email address could get you jobs. So these symbols play a large role into our future. Education has a manifest function, even in symbolic interactionalism, towards the idea of learning and gaining knowledge. But the unintended or latent function is that it creates barriers that may or may not be able to be passed based on certain socioeconomic statuses, and it creates norms, values, and traditions that end up impacting our life choices in general. If you've been told that you are an untalented academic student, it's not likely that you're going to put an emphasis on school. You may look into other ways to make money, right? Entrepreneurship or innovation or other systems. So how we're impacted by labeling theory is really big, and how education is looked at from the interactionalist perspective is very fascinating. So I'm going to kind of slide through these decks pretty quickly, so don't expect anything super long, just because I think it's interesting to cover them, and then I will go to the next portion on a new video. What is health according to sociology and social institutions? Well, health is a state of a complete and physical, mental, and social well-being. Health is not just a personal choice or biology. Health is a personal and public. Patterns of illness and well-being are rooted in the social and organizational of society, meaning that health is defined by how we look at it, right? Through history, it's changed through sin, sickness, and selective. We used to use leeches. Now we don't use leeches. We used to not wash our instruments when we do surgeries. Many people died more from the disease, from having a bone surgery, like in the Civil War, than they actually did during the surgery. They died from actually getting gangrene after having the incident. So what you're looking at is the changing of health is also based on personal and public perspective and access of resources that you have. If you're rich, many times you can survive cancer. If you're poor, you're probably going to die from cancer because it's rooted in systemic inequality. Society shapes health in four major ways. Essentially, cultural patterns define health. What has been seen as healthy is often reflects what is morally good. Think back to my example with Civil War, right? People died more from the gangrene than the operation. Soldiers were more terrified to get surgery than they were to actually the injury they had. Culture standards of health change over time. Absolutely, that happens on a regular basis. It also shapes what we see and view as treatment. Society shapes our health in these ways. What's dominant at the time is also moral. Competitive is good as competition, competitively is good, competition is good, or right, we're looking at this as good, or homosexuals are ill. We saw the idea of AIDS epidemic, right? In this sense, we're seeing with monkeypox, which is sad. In this sense, ideas about health and act are formed of social control, encouraging conformity to the cultural norms. Cultural standards of health change over time, bathing, smoking, etc. Around 40% of the US adults smoked in 1960, 14% in 2008. Food is a great example of this. Spicy food was considered unhealthy. It was a stimulant that would make you nervous, right? So food even plays into this. Can you think of any other things that have changed and shifted and osculated? I'd love to hear it. Here's a fun figure of the progression of smoking per capita. Take a look at that if you'd like. Interesting ad. This is an actual ad. Buy some army bonds and send your love some camels, right? The FDA was created in 1906. If you didn't know, drugs before 1906 be on some crazy shit. Look at this: cannabis, alcohol, chloroform, morphine. That's a hell of a cough syrup. It's not a matter if you're going to sleep. It's, are you going to wake up? And, just being a doctor in the old would have been fun, right? Just take some cocaine and just like tell people their blood has demons in it. Health, sin, sickness, and select, right? Crazy. So society shapes health in four major ways. Like I said, what you also see is what is seen as healthy often reflects what's more good, also shapes treatment. Now we're going to go into society's technology affects people's health, right? Health in a historical fashion, examples of health and technology, hunter and gatherer, you're screwed. You get sick, you're going to die. Agricultural and domestication of animals improve things, but social inequalities created a paradox, plus domestication and urbanization faces disease. How many diseases we get to see in the sense of how many people were impacted by living near livestock. Right? Even if so, in large, public health was not great for the vast majority of humans' existence. And the precautions, you'd probably die during infancy. Ever wonder why families had 9 to 10 children? And if you've ever lived, you probably die from a disease that's currently preventable and treatable. A lot of this is stemmed from the lack of sanitation, unsafe housing, and lack of meaningful treatment and prevention that has led to a longer lifespan in the general in the human existence. Public health wasn't great, although through these stayed away centuries, slim odds that you'd make it past infancy. Disease was the major killer. Look at this list: influenza, pneumonia, cholera, tuberculosis, diphtheria, smallpox, measles. These are all things that were majorly impactful in mortality rates. Are they now? Think about that. Health changes with the matter of technology, pulling back to Lenski. So let's talk about the Industrial Revolution, yeah? So the industrialization initially exacerbated health inequalities, but in the long run, there has been improvements in the overall standards of living, longer life expectancy, less disease, and so forth. Better nutrition, safer housings were important factors. So we were scientific and technological advancements in medicine, vaccines, antibodies, pharmaceuticals, sterilization of tools, etc. The emergence of the medical as a public institution that focuses on fighting disease and improving public health. Throughout much of the human history of health and care, there was responsibilities of families and individuals. There was also this more diversity in the terms of philosophies of healing, acupuncture, herbalism, spiritualism, scientific, and who was performed healing. Doctors, herbalists, druggists, midwives, ministers, shamans, right? In the 19th century, doctors applied rationalization principles and transformed medicine into a refined science by systematically studying the human body and how it works, emphasizing surgery and promotion of drugs as a means of fighting disease. Overflow, essentially, what we're looking at, right, is in the colonial era, there was more diversity in terms of philosophies of healing, acupuncture, herbalism, right, and who performed the healing doctors. Three foundations of holistic medicines. If you're interested in this, when I'm mentioning this, i.e. an approach to health that's not emphasizing the prevention of illness. We have treat the patients as people, encourage responsibility, not dependency, and provide personal treatment. This is a good thing. So science and rationalization, we have this idea, institutionalization of medicine, note the public health, med schools, centralized curriculum and practices, National Health Agency, CDC, NIH, etc. So there's benefits to this, but there's also dynamics that aren't so good. The shift of reshaped the practice of medicine, how medicine was viewed in society. White privileged men became increasingly dominant in the field, while women were pushed out. So we no longer have the midwives and a lot of the more non-traditional methods. Also, the income and prestige of the medical doctor increased manifold, while the chiropractors, herbal healers, midwives, and traditional healers in general declined. So you see a change and more towards what is called, in many situations, you're looking at the problem where healthcare has become indoctrinated by the idea of only focusing on what we want to see and what we don't want to see. Now, healthcare as a therapeutic level, we have the functionalist, which is the sick role, right? Functionalist illness is a dysfunction because it undermines people's ability to perform their roles. Medicine is just society's strategy to keep its members healthy. Society responds to sickness just as with care, but they also were affording people sick or the sick role. The sick role patterns of behavior defined as appropriate for people who are ill. In general, a sick person is not held personally responsible for their illness. They're entitled to certain rights and privileges, and they're expected to take these steps and get well. Right? They're entitled to a certain rights and privileges, and they are, as I said, expected to get well. This releases people from the normal obligations, but they must look the part. If any of you have seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? What if the one thing he does? He licks his palms and even says that's weird because of clammy hands being associated with being ill, right? Critique to this, while this idea reveals how the person is ill is integral part of the larger social context, there's some issues. It is not portable across all contexts, cultures, and times and periods. Also, what about alcoholism, certain disabilities, and chronic diseases? Although not everyone has equal opportunity to take advantage of the sick role, either through politics, culture, or conflicting diagnoses, also happens to perpetuate, and perhaps more importantly, the primary disease that kills us related to personal behaviors like stroke, heart disease, to some degree, cancer. So there's different dynamics that how we understand it, but we're expected to follow a sick role from the functionalist view. So Looking at this from here, we also have a little fun meme for you. Come back and look at the slide if you'd like to. So functionalist is the stick roll, symbolic and interactionalist, social construction of illness, treatment, and identity. Goffman's dramaturgical analysis. Symbolic looks at it as such. 1 second here. Health and illness are socially constructed by people in everyday interactions. In other words, health is less objective fact than it is a negotiated outcome. It is normal in America to eat a quarter pound of sugar and 3,600 grams of sodium every day. That's bonkers in other places. If you've traveled, you might notice that certain things are sweeter or taste better overseas because they use a less definitive amount of sugar in their food, right? If you've traveled, let me know if you've experienced that. Societal response to illness and disease is often based upon less on medical facts and more on the cultural constructions. AIDS patients face stigma despite without medical basis. Treatment in situations, this is what's happened with monkeypox, by the way. Treatment is situational, in which the patient and the medical staff engage in subtle process of reality construction. A critical eye would suggest that this suggests no objection standards of well-being. There is a symbolic importance to health. Take body parts, for example. Folks whose limbs or parts of their reproductive organs not feeling whole or complete as a human and or as a man or a woman. We have that situation there. Conflict would challenge this. Capitalism and the profit is motivated in sinking the whole ship within the health and linked to inexhaustibly to social inequality, with the rich people having considerably more access to the cares and lifestyle. So symbolic is looking at the little interactions, but the reality is that's not always the case. So Goffman looks at that from the front stage, backstage, conflict, again, like I just mentioned, with the rules, they're all equal. So who is healthy? Well, let's look at this. It's called social epidemiology, the study of health and patterns. Social epidemiology, as I said, is the study of how health and disease are distributed throughout society's populations. In many parts of Africa, people have a life expectancy of barely 50, and in some of the poorest countries barely make it to their teens. The World Health Organization estimates 1 billion people around the world suffer from serious illness due to poverty, sanitation, scant medical personnel, etc., right? It's a big issue. Well, widespread dispersities tend to reflect overall development, right? So parts of Africa versus the US, not all is perfect in paradise, though. Infant mortality rates between US and Europe have raised. We're also looking at who is healthy specifically. Well, mentioning there, we have this idea of obviously proclivities for certain illnesses, injuries, and death by age. Gender, women have a better health because one, less likely to die less likely to die or immediately after birth. Men are typically socialized to be more aggressive, competitive, and dominant. And we all just think of the guy jumping off Tempe Town Lake. Come on, one of y'all better not do this semester, which leads to more accidents, murder, injury, but also things of coronary disease, class. If you're rich and have certain dynamics, huge factor of if you're going to survive. Race, big differences between blacks and whites, not as much between whites and Hispanics, although it still exists. Poverty is a big driver towards the health gap and wealth gap, right? So generally, we're pretty good in the United States, but it definitely varies by geography. So here's what you're looking at is the 20-year gap between the highest and lowest countries the US has areas. So if you're interested in that, another interesting here is wealth explains a lot of this, right? A lot of this that you're looking at on this data here, I just wanted to make an idea of this. In the Summit, Aspen, and Pitkin, and Elgin, adjacent to both, Marin and Fairfax counties have stupid, crazy money. The Alaskans and Texans example of a trip, right? In the Presidio, part of Hispanics and health paradox, longer life expectancy relative to whites, despite much lower levels of wealth of income. That's interesting. Is the paradox real though? Perhaps it has to created by the patterns of selected migration, like only the healthy can make it, or perhaps it's the Salmon bias, right? Which suggests that Hispanics tend to return home towards the end of life, ultimately rendering as an individual statistically immoral and thus artificially lowering mortality for Hispanics in the United States. Might make sense for the Presidio because it has the right on the border close to Juarez. Maybe it's real though, caused by social-cultural factors characterized by the Latino or Latina population, such as cultural values, interpersonal relationships. There's a lot of different dynamics to this, but you can see there's different impacts on culture, race, status, and class, right? So what we're looking at here is just some more data on regards to US and county equivalents with the shortest life expectancy. Accidental liver diseases, heart diseases, diabetes played here. Suicide, alcohol complications, and drug overdoses are also causing. This is also what Case and Deaton in 2015 talk about deaths of despair. So it's not that there's a situation of unhealthiness. It's also people who are so sad and overwhelmed that they end up using drugs and other ways to facilitate and alleviate their despair. And yeah, here you go with the deaths of despair. Look at these counties and the areas and the declining expectancy of life. Opiates. Look where they're hitting, what communities are hitting. Powerful stuff. So who is healthy again? Well, as we see, there is a wide gaps in health by age, social class, race, ethnicity, gender. Toxic masculinity is a big factor here, right? So obviously proclivities and for certain illnesses, injuries, death by age, class, again, gender and race, these all impact it. We have toxic masculinity, men doing stupid things, guys be dumb. But here's a nice photo for you if you're interested. Look at this. This is a definition of fight or flight, right? So this video is pretty cool if you're interested. But let's dive a little more deep in regards to what we're looking at with the data here. Expectancy of death at 40 years old. We're looking at men and women. Interesting gap between the male and females, right? We have women at the bottom at 78.5, women at the top at 88.8, men at the bottom at 72.3, men at the top at 87.3. Kind of a big change there, right? 10-year female gap is equivalent to the health effects of a lifetime of smoking, right? And then with the 15-year gap is equivalent between the US and the Sudan. One other interesting here by source, again, on the bottom here, is geographic life expectancy in the bottom in quintile, so the lower, the variable where high income people live longest, not as large and as much geographically concentrated. We have the national age, right? With getting back to the paradox of certain aspects of why Hispanics are living longer than whites, if whites have a longer history of wealth. Also, there's a paradox in regards to why Asian Americans and Asians in general have a higher life expectancy. Fascinating stuff if you're interested. You can also look at here. What's powerful to look at here, if you want me to point it out, is that white and black gap has gotten smaller over time throughout 47 to 33 in 1900s, 79 and 75 in 2014. This can also be due to the fact that racial differences were stark, 47 for what was 33 for blacks. This gap was closed by 1950, 69 for whites, 60 for blacks, and today's 79 versus 75. So that reflects positive change, also based on the socioeconomic and cultural understandings of our interactions, right? So the heart of the matter, what's up with the variation? 3 important factors: poverty and economic insecurities. Economic insecurities and precarities. Does your income oscillate appreciably within the span of the year from year to year? Income violations, income volatility can come from a large and unexpected economic shocks such as job loss, divorce, etc. So income plays a large role. Structural racism, having access to the system, access to service, related both to the urban versus rural dynamic. We have different aspects of structural: housing segregation, disproportionate exposure to unsafe environments, healthcare discrimination, denial of treatment, lackluster treatment, myth of the Black folks being impervious to pain. This is a big deal. This is one of the reasons that we don't look at race as a biological fact anymore. And yeah, there's a lot more slides here. And honestly, I wanted to go further with you with all this. I'm kind of just sharing through it because I think it's important for you to see it. But like I mentioned in the beginning, I have a lot more slides for this deck. I just don't think it's going to be worth your time for me to take you through every single one. If you'd like me to, email me. I'll go through it with you. A Zoom, personal meeting, whatever you'd like. But I'm going to stop the video here just for transparency to not overwhelm you. Hope you've enjoyed this video. I will see you for the next part where we do a little bit different type of discussion around social institutions. I'll see you soon.